By mid-November, the first snow of the season had begun to accumulate, blanketing the valley in a sheet of white. The temperature plunged to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on the coldest nights, with the wind howling through the pines. Inside Jonas Fletcher's cabin, the fire roared in the stone fireplace, but the heat barely reached the corners. By the end of February, Jonas had burned through 4 cords of firewood, a staggering amount, 3 times what most men needed. His cabin, built with traditional methods, was leaking heat at every possible gap. The cold seemed to creep through the walls no matter how much wood he tossed into the fire. But Fletcher had a plan, an innovation that could change everything. Could a simple metal plate really improve the stove's efficiency and keep him warmer with less fuel? The math would decide who wintered and who left. The sharp cold cut through the valley as Jonas Fletcher's breath fogged in the air. Snow began to fall, dusting the ground, with temperatures dipping below, freezing each night by late October 1834. Fletcher had arrived in the Wind River Valley that summer. A carpenter by trade from Virginia, born in 1809, he'd worked timber frames and board construction back east. He knew how to build, or so he thought. The cabin he threw together in 3 weeks that August followed every pattern he'd seen other trappers use. Logs stacked tight, mud packed between the gaps, stone fireplace at one end. Standard construction. Everyone did it that way. By November, he understood his mistake. The logs had been cut in late summer when the sap was still running. He hadn't seasoned them properly, stacked them with the bark still on because removing it seemed like extra work. Used whatever chinking material was handy, clay from the creek bank, moss from the shaded areas, even grass stuffed in the bigger gaps. Built his fireplace on the north wall because that's where the ground was flattest. The entire structure took 21 days to complete. He was proud of his speed. That first winter taught him the cost of haste. The unseasoned logs shrank as they dried. Gaps opened between them that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The bark held moisture, encouraging rot. The clay chinking cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away. The moss dried out and fell out in chunks. And that north wall fireplace. That was the worst problem of all. The stone structure sat against the outer wall, so half its warmth radiated uselessly to the exterior. The log walls themselves conducted heat away faster than the fireplace could replace it. On the coldest nights, Jonas could watch frost creep across the inside of the walls, despite keeping the fire roaring. He burned 4 cords of wood per month, 3 times what it should have taken. His hands were raw from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. And still the cold seeped through those walls like they were made of paper. Come summer, the same cabin turned into an oven. The thick log walls that couldn't hold warmth in winter somehow trapped every bit of summer heat, making sleep impossible. Jonas wasn't alone in this problem. Every trapper building cabins in the mountains faced similar brutal reality. The standard cabin design that worked reasonably well in eastern forests became nearly unlivable in the extreme temperature swings of the high country. Summer days could hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter nights dropped to 30 below. The same structure had to handle both. Traditional construction methods failed at that task more often than they succeeded. But Jonas had something most trappers didn't. He had carpentry training. He understood how materials worked, how joints fit, how structures bore weight. What he didn't understand yet was heat, how it moved, how it escaped, how to trap it where it mattered. That knowledge would come from an unexpected source. Fletcher stood in the cold December morning, staring at his dwindling woodpile. Each log he split seemed to disappear into the fire within hours. December 1835 brought temperatures that rarely climbed above 0. The wind never stopped. Snow fell almost daily. Inside the cabin, the fire burned constantly. The stone fireplace consumed wood at a relentless pace. Jonas fed it split logs every 2 hours during the day, every 4 hours at night, when he forced himself awake to keep the fire going. The mathematics were brutal. 1 cord of firewood, a stack measuring 8 feet long, 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, lasted approximately 1 week. By the end of December, Jonas had burned through more than 4 cords. His wood pile, which had seemed adequate in October, was shrinking at an alarming rate. He spent 3 hours each day cutting and splitting wood. 3 hours he should have been checking trap lines, processing pelts, hunting for meat. 3 hours stolen from the work that would actually earn him money. The opportunity cost was staggering. A good trapper could process 15 beaver pelts in 3 hours. At current prices, those pelts would fetch approximately $30. Over a winter season, that translated to hundreds of dollars in lost income. Jonas was burning his fortune in the fireplace. The technical problem was straightforward, though Jonas didn't fully understand it yet. Heat moved in 3 ways: conduction through materials, convection through air movement, and radiation from hot surfaces. His fireplace radiated heat in all directions. Half of it went straight into the exterior wall and then outside. The rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually conducted heat away constantly. The cabin had no thermal mass inside the insulated envelope. Every bit of warmth the fire created either escaped immediately or was absorbed by materials that then radiated it to the outside. It was an exercise in futility. Like heating the entire valley instead of just the cabin's interior. By mid-December, Jonas knew something fundamental was wrong. He just didn't know what. Other trappers who passed through offered little help. They faced the same problems. Everyone burned excessive wood. Everyone's cabin stayed cold. That's just how it was in the mountains. Accept it or leave. Jonas wasn't ready to leave. He'd invested too much to quit after 1 season. But he also wasn't willing to spend another winter freezing and bankrupting himself in firewood. There had to be a better way. The answer would come in the fall of 1835 when a Swedish trapper named Neils Bergstrom stopped at Jonas's cabin while passing through the valley. Bergstrom had been in the mountains since the early 1820s. He'd survived winters that killed other men. He'd learned through brutal experience what worked and what didn't. He looked at Jonas's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. Neils Bergstrom arrived on a cold afternoon in late September 1835. He was traveling south, checking his trap lines before winter arrived. "You're cold here," Bergstrom said when he saw the cabin. It wasn't a question. Jonas didn't bother denying it. "Colder than I've ever been. Can't figure why. Logs are tight mostly. Got a good fireplace." Bergstrom walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed on some of the logs, checked the chinking, looked at how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Jonas had no idea what that meant. Bergstrom explained it in the straightforward way of someone who'd figured out these principles through hard experience. Heat moved in specific ways, he said. It radiated from hot surfaces, like a fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. The problem with Jonas's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. The rising heat escaped through gaps near the roof line that Jonas hadn't sealed properly. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually acted as moderate conductors. Not terrible insulators, but not good ones either. And the cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. In the old country, Bergstrom said, we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center, or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by the warm air so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night. Jonas listened carefully. Everything Bergstrom told him contradicted the standard wisdom he'd followed, but that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. Bergstrom explained that the best cabins he'd seen in the Rockies were built by trappers who'd learned from their mistakes. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or moss between them. They sealed every gap with proper chinking materials that wouldn't crack or fall out. Jonas began planning his second attempt, but first he needed to understand fire itself better. Jonas bent over his workbench in the dim light of early November 1835. In front of him lay pieces of scrap metal from old beaver traps that had broken beyond repair. He'd been thinking about Bergstrom's advice for weeks. The concept of thermal mass made sense. Build the fireplace where its heat stayed inside. But Jonas didn't have time or resources to rebuild his entire cabin before winter arrived in force. He needed a solution that worked with what he already had. The idea came to him while staring into his fireplace one evening. He watched the flames dance, watched the smoke rise straight up the chimney, watched heat escape into the cold November air. Most of the energy from burning wood went up the chimney as hot smoke and gases. The wood burned. The smoke rose. The heat left. What if there was a way to capture more of that heat before it escaped? Jonas had seen cook stoves back in Virginia with metal plates inside the firebox. The plates forced smoke to take a longer path before exiting, extracting more heat in the process. Could the same principle work in a stone fireplace? The technical challenge was straightforward. He needed a plate that would sit in the throat of the firebox, the narrow passage between the fire chamber and the chimney. The plate would force the hot gases to swirl back down into the flames before eventually rising again. This would create what later engineers would call secondary combustion. Gases that would normally escape up the chimney would be forced back into the heat, burning more completely, and releasing additional energy. Jonas had no formal understanding of combustion chemistry. He just knew that smoke represented unburned fuel. If he could burn that smoke, he'd get more heat from each log. The metal plate he constructed measured 8 inches by 12 inches, cut from a piece of trap spring steel. He filed the edges smooth, drilled 4 holes in the corners, attached short chains that would allow the plate to hang at an angle in the firebox throat. The plate needed to block most of the opening, but not all of it. Smoke still had to escape eventually. The trick was forcing it to take the long way out. By mid-November, Jonas had the plate ready. Installation would be the real test. Jonas installed the baffle plate on a cold morning in late November 1835. The EI temperature outside hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. He let his fire die down to coals, then climbed partially into the fireplace. The stones still radiated heat, making the work uncomfortable. He suspended the plate from the 4 chains, positioning it approximately 6 inches below the chimney opening, angled slightly to deflect gases downward and forward. The entire installation took 30 minutes. He rebuilt the fire slowly, adding small pieces of kindling first, then larger splits. Within minutes, he noticed the difference. The flames changed. Instead of the normal yellow-orange flames, blue flames began dancing along the burning wood. The fire sounded different, too, a sharper, more intense crackle. The blue flames indicated complete combustion. The gases that would normally escape as smoke were burning in the firebox. The heat output increased noticeably. Jonas stood back and watched. Smoke that would normally pour up the chimney was being pulled back into the fire by the downward deflection of the baffle. The smoke ignited. More heat stayed in the cabin instead of escaping up the flue. The immediate results were striking. The cabin warmed faster. The fire burned with less visible smoke. The wood seemed to last longer. Jonas monitored his firewood consumption carefully over the next week. His normal consumption was approximately 1 cord every 7 days. With the baffle installed, the same amount of wood lasted 10 days, a 43% reduction in fuel consumption. The mathematics translated to immediate practical benefits. 3 hours per day spent cutting wood became 2 hours. 4 cords per month became fewer than 3 cords. The savings compounded over the winter season. By December, Jonas had documented the improvement in his ledger. Firewood consumption reduced, baffle effective, cabin warmer with half effort. Other changes became apparent over time. The chimney stayed cleaner. Without so much unburned material escaping as creosote, the flue didn't clog as quickly. This meant less frequent dangerous climbs onto the roof to scrape deposits. The air quality inside the cabin improved. Less smoke meant clearer air, easier breathing, fewer respiratory problems. A simple metal plate was transforming winter survival. Fletcher sat at his rough-hewn table in January 1836, tallying his firewood consumption. For the first time since arriving in the valley, he wasn't cutting wood every single day. The numbers told a clear story. December 1834, without the baffle, 4 cords consumed. December 1835 with the baffle, 2 cords consumed. The reduction was precisely 50%. This translated to more than just saved labor. It represented a fundamental shift in how Jonas could structure his time and resources. 3 hours per day no longer disappeared into firewood production. That time could be redirected to trap lines, to processing pelts, to hunting, to the work that actually generated income. Over a 6-month winter season, the time savings totaled approximately 540 hours. That was equivalent to 67 full 8-hour workdays. 2 months of labor reclaimed from the woodpile. The economic impact was substantial. A trapper's winter income depended entirely on pelts processed. More time on trap lines meant more pelts. More pelts meant more money. The baffle was effectively increasing Jonas's earning potential by giving him back half his firewood labor time. But the benefits extended beyond personal economics. The reduced firewood consumption meant less pressure on local forests. In areas where trappers and settlers clustered, the impact on nearby timber was significant. Every cabin burning 4 cords per month created heavy demand on accessible wood. When that demand dropped to 2 cords, the local forest could sustain twice as many inhabitants. Jonas also noticed health improvements. The cleaner burn produced less smoke inside the cabin. Without constant exposure to wood smoke, his breathing was easier. His eyes didn't water as much. The persistent cough that had plagued him the previous winter didn't return. The cabin stayed warmer with less effort. The stone fireplace, now retaining more of the fire's heat, acted as the thermal mass Bergstrom had described. It absorbed heat during peak burning times and radiated it back into the space for hours afterward. Jonas could let the fire die down to coals overnight and wake to a cabin that was still tolerably warm. The baffle had solved the fundamental problem: how to extract maximum heat from limited fuel. The word spread through that peculiar network that connected trappers across vast distances. A man stops at your cabin, notices something unusual, mentions it to the next trapper he encounters. That man tells another. Within months, information travels hundreds of miles. By early 1837, trappers passing through the Wind River Valley began stopping at Jonas Fletcher's cabin specifically to see the modified stove. The first was a French-Canadian named Remy, who trapped the tributaries north of Fletcher's territory. He arrived in February, following smoke he'd seen rising from Jonas's chimney. "Your smoke runs clean," Remy observed. "Almost no visible plume." "How?" Jonas showed him the baffle, explained how it worked, described the fuel savings and improved heat output. Remy studied the installation carefully, asked questions about the metal thickness, the angle of suspension, the distance from the chimney opening. He left 3 days later with sketches and measurements. By spring, Remy had installed similar baffles in his own cabin. He reported fuel consumption dropping from his previous 3.5 cords monthly to fewer than 2 cords. Other trappers followed similar patterns. A pair of brothers from Kentucky stopped in March. An older trapper named Samuels visited in April. Each came curious. Each left with knowledge. The design adapted as it spread. Some trappers used heavier metal that retained heat longer. Others experimented with different angles. A few modified the basic concept for their particular firebox configurations. Jonas shared his techniques freely. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. He was trying to survive, and if others could benefit from what he'd learned, that was acceptable. The knowledge sharing reflected the communal approach to frontier living. Building a cabin that worked properly meant the difference between surviving winter and freezing to death. People shared survival knowledge because everyone's life depended on it. By mid-1837, at least a dozen cabins within 50 miles of Fletcher's location had incorporated some version of the baffle design. The fuel savings were consistent across all implementations, between 40 and 60% reduction compared to standard open firebox designs. The simple metal plate was becoming standard mountain equipment. Jonas made a trip to St. Louis in the summer of 1837 to sell his season's pelts. The fur market was still reasonably strong. His catch had been good. With the time saved from reduced firewood needs, he'd trapped more beaver than any previous season. While in the city, he visited a foundry that manufactured iron cook stoves. The proprietor, a man named Heinrich Schmidt, was a German immigrant who'd been producing stoves since 1832. His designs were conventional, simple fireboxes with flat tops for cooking, basic flue systems, cast iron construction. Jonas described his baffle modification, explained the principle, provided measurements and sketches. Schmidt was skeptical at first. The design seemed too simple, but he agreed to cast a trial unit with an integrated baffle as part of the internal structure. The first modified stove was completed in August 1837. Schmidt installed it in his own home for testing. By October, he was convinced. The fuel savings were exactly as Jonas had described. The stove burned hotter with less wood. The iron retained heat longer. The chimney stayed cleaner. Schmidt began producing the modified design as a standard option. He called it the mountain pattern stove to distinguish it from his conventional models. The price was slightly higher, $12 instead of $10, but the fuel savings justified the expense. A stove that burned 50% less wood would pay for itself in a single season through reduced firewood costs. By 1839, Schmidt was producing approximately 200 mountain pattern stoves annually. Most were sold to customers heading west, settlers, traders, ranchers moving into territories where firewood efficiency mattered. The design spread through commercial channels in addition to word of mouth among trappers. A purchaser in Missouri would take the stove west. Neighbors would see it in operation. They'd order similar units. The baffle concept, born from Jonas, Fletcher's cold winters and experimental tinkering, was becoming industrialized. Schmidt never paid Jonas royalties. Patent law at the time was inconsistent, and enforcement in frontier territories was essentially non-existent. Jonas didn't pursue compensation. His goal had been survival, not profit. The knowledge itself was the valuable thing. And it was spreading. The winter of 1837 to 1838 brought conditions that tested every structure in the Rocky Mountains. A series of Arctic air masses pushed south from Canada beginning in late December. By early January, temperatures across Wyoming Territory had plummeted to levels that killed poorly prepared settlers and destroyed inadequate shelters. January 5, 1838. Temperature at dawn, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest at 25 miles per hour. Effective temperature, minus 75 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions persisted for 6 days. Jonas Fletcher's cabin, equipped with the baffle he'd installed more than 2 years earlier, became a proving ground. He maintained the fire at a moderate level. Not the roaring inferno he'd burned in his first winter, but a steady, controlled burn. The baffle extracted maximum heat from each log. The stone fireplace absorbed and radiated warmth. The cabin stayed at approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit inside, cold by modern standards, but survivable and vastly better than the exterior conditions. His firewood consumption during this extreme period, approximately half a cord per week. In his first winter without the baffle, similar temperatures would have required 4 times that amount. Other trappers weren't as fortunate. William Crawford, whose claim adjoined Jonas's to the south, had built his cabin using traditional methods. Single-thickness walls, fireplace against the exterior wall, standard chinking. Crawford survived the cold snap, but barely. He burned every piece of furniture he could spare. When his stacked firewood ran out, he began cutting logs in weather that made the work dangerous. His cabin never warmed above freezing during the 6 coldest days. When the temperature finally moderated on January 11th, Crawford rode to Fletcher's cabin. "Show me how you built that metal plate," he said. Jonas spent the next day helping Crawford fabricate and install a baffle in his fireplace. The installation was crude compared to Jonas's refined design, but it worked. Crawford's firewood consumption dropped immediately. His cabin warmed. He survived the rest of the winter without crisis. The extreme test had validated the baffle's effectiveness in the harshest possible conditions. Spring brought the annual gathering of trappers at the Green River Rendezvous. Men who'd spent the winter isolated in various valleys converged to trade, resupply, and exchange information. The topic dominating conversations in 1838 was winter survival. The brutal cold had killed livestock, destroyed structures, and forced several families to abandon their claims. But it had also validated preparation. Those who'd built properly and adopted efficient heating methods had survived without crisis. Jonas Fletcher attended the rendezvous with a good season's worth of pelts. His winter had been productive specifically because he hadn't spent all his time cutting firewood. At the gathering, he encountered more than a dozen trappers who'd installed baffle modifications based on descriptions they'd heard or seen at other cabins. Each reported similar results: fuel consumption reduced by 40 to 60%, cleaner burns, easier winters. A Methodist missionary named Parker, who was traveling through the region documenting frontier life, took particular interest. He recorded in his journal, "Met a trapper who has devised a simple modification to fireplace design that greatly improves efficiency. Several others have adopted this method. Firewood consumption reduced by half. This innovation may prove valuable as more settlers arrive in territories where wood is scarce." Parker's journal wouldn't be published until 1840, but it provided documentary evidence of the baffle's spread and impact. By late 1838, an informal survey suggested that at least 23 cabins within 70 miles of Fletcher's original location had incorporated baffle modifications. The exact number was certainly higher. The survey only counted those who happened to attend the rendezvous or were encountered during spring travel. The innovation had spread beyond individual adoption into community standard practice. New trappers arriving in the region were advised to install baffles as basic winter preparation. Experienced mountain men included baffle specifications in the advice they gave to newcomers. The knowledge had become part of the collective wisdom that allowed survival in harsh environments. Jonas Fletcher's contribution was being absorbed into the larger body of frontier craft knowledge. His name wasn't attached to the innovation in most cases. It was simply how you built a proper stove if you wanted to survive mountain winters efficiently. The decline of the fur trade in the early 1840s coincided with increased overland migration to Oregon and California. thousands of settlers began moving west along trails that passed through or near the territories where baffle designs had become standard. These settlers needed practical guidance on frontier construction and survival. Publishers in eastern cities recognized the market opportunity. In 1841, a guidebook titled The Prairie Traveler's Complete Manual of Construction and Craft was published in Cincinnati. The author, a former Army officer named Randolph Marcy, had spent years in frontier territories gathering practical knowledge. The manual included a detailed section on stove and fireplace construction. Marcy wrote, "The traveler, establishing a permanent station in territories where firewood is scarce or difficult to obtain, should install a baffle plate in the stove throat. This simple device, fashioned from scrap iron or steel, forces smoke and gases to combust more completely before exiting the flue. Fuel consumption may be reduced by half, a savings of immense value during harsh winters." Marcy provided specific instructions, dimensions, materials, installation procedures, expected results. The manual sold approximately 3,000 copies in its first year. Subsequent editions expanded the section based on additional reports from users. By 1845, the baffle recommendation had been copied into at least 4 other settler guidebooks. The knowledge that had spread through oral tradition among trappers was now systematized in printed form. Settlers who'd never met Jonas Fletcher or anyone who'd learned directly from him could still benefit from the innovation. The industrialization of the concept through Schmidt's stove foundry proceeded in parallel. By 1843, at least 5 different foundries were producing stoves with integrated baffle designs. Some credited the mountain pattern as the source. Others simply incorporated the feature without specific attribution. The technique had become generic, part of standard stove engineering rather than a specific named innovation. This pattern of knowledge transfer, from individual experiment to community practice to published standard to industrial incorporation, would repeat across countless frontier innovations. The baffle was simply one documented example of how practical knowledge moved through American frontier society. Jonas Fletcher remained in the Wind River Valley through the collapse of the fur trade. By 1842, beaver populations had been trapped out in many areas. More significantly, silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production in eastern markets. The economic foundation of the mountain man era was dissolving. Many trappers left for Oregon or California. Others moved to settlements and took up different trades. The mountain valleys that had supported hundreds of trappers could no longer sustain that population through trapping alone. Jonas transitioned to a different model. He'd learned the country. He knew the passes, the water sources, the weather patterns. He began guiding settler parties through the mountains, using knowledge he'd gained during his trapping years. His cabin, that carefully built structure with its efficient baffle-equipped fireplace, became a way station. Travelers could stop, rest, warm themselves, and receive advice before continuing their journeys. The family ledger from 1842 shows an interesting detail. The column for firewood purchases, previously a significant expense, drops to 0. Jonas had refined his wood gathering and management to the point where he could sustain his household entirely from deadfall collection and selective cutting. The baffle efficiency meant he needed so little wood that casual gathering sufficed. He married in 1843. His wife, a Norwegian woman named Ingrid, who'd arrived with a settler family, brought her own knowledge of efficient heating from Scandinavian traditions. Together they managed the cabin and guide business. They raised 4 children in that structure. The cabin stood until 1867, when Jonas was 58 years old. He finally built a larger house to accommodate his grown children's families when they visited. The old cabin was dismantled carefully. The stones from the fireplace were reused in the new house's foundation. The baffle plate, worn thin from 27 years of use, was kept as a reminder. Jonas Fletcher died in 1881 at age 72, having lived far longer than most mountain men of his era. He never claimed credit for revolutionizing stove design. He'd solved a problem. Others had benefited. That was sufficient. The baffle plate that Jonas Fletcher fabricated in November 1835 exists today. His descendants donated it to the Wyoming Pioneer Museum in Lander in 1923. The piece measures 8 inches by 12 inches, exactly as Fletcher cut it from trap spring steel. The corners show the holes he drilled for suspension chains. The surface displays the characteristic wear pattern from decades of exposure to flame and hot gases. Metallurgical analysis conducted in 1978 confirmed the material as high-carbon steel, typical of trap springs manufactured in the 1830s. The wear patterns indicate approximately 25 to 30 years of active use before retirement. The museum display includes Fletcher's handwritten ledger pages documenting firewood consumption before and after baffle installation. The numbers are clear. 4 cords monthly reduced to 2 cords monthly, sustained across 3 documented winters. The broader impact of the baffle innovation is harder to quantify precisely, but documentary evidence suggests significant adoption. Parish records from Methodist missionaries traveling through Rocky Mountain territories between 1836 and 1845 mention improved stove efficiency in at least 37 specific references. Settler diaries and letters archived in various state historical societies reference smoke plates or baffle modifications in 41 documented instances. Commercial stove production records from Schmidt's Foundry show 2,378 mountain pattern units manufactured between 1837 and 1850. Other foundries produced similar numbers. A conservative estimate suggests that several thousand stoves incorporated baffle principles by 1850. Each represented fuel savings of 40 to 60%. Across all installations, the cumulative firewood savings totaled tens of thousands of cords annually. This translated to reduced labor, reduced forest impact, improved air quality, and better survival odds during severe winters. The innovation worked because it solved a real problem with available materials and simple mechanics. No advanced metallurgy, no complex manufacturing, just a metal plate positioned correctly to redirect exhaust gases. The principle behind Fletcher's baffle is still used in modern high-efficiency wood stoves. Contemporary designs employ more sophisticated materials and engineering, but the fundamental concept, forcing exhaust to combust more completely before exiting, remains identical. The metal plate in the museum represents knowledge that spread across continents and persisted across centuries. Jonas Fletcher's Firebox Baffle wasn't revolutionary in the sense of being entirely new. Metal plates used to direct smoke and improve combustion had existed in various forms in European stove design for decades. What Fletcher did was adapt the principle specifically for frontier conditions using available materials. He took a concept, tested it in extreme circumstances, and shared it freely with others who needed it. The innovation spread because it worked. Trappers adopted it because it saved labor and fuel. Commercial foundries incorporated it because customers wanted efficiency. Guidebook authors included it because settlers needed practical advice. The pattern, individual experiment leading to community adoption, leading to commercial standardization, characterized countless frontier innovations. Most have been forgotten. Fletcher's baffle survives in documentary records only because his descendants preserved the original plate and ledgers. The broader lesson speaks to how knowledge moves through communities under pressure. When survival depends on efficiency, good ideas spread rapidly. When sharing knowledge benefits everyone, people share freely. Fletcher never sought recognition or compensation. He solved a problem that was killing him through wasted labor and inadequate heat. The solution worked. Others benefited. That was sufficient. The baffle plate hangs in the Wyoming Pioneer Museum today, a piece of worked metal measuring 8 inches by 12 inches. Visitors pass it without recognition usually. It's just an old piece of metal in a display case. But that plate represents something important. It represents the distance between adequate and efficient, between surviving and thriving, between accepting conditions as they are and changing them through careful observation and practical experiment. Jonas Fletcher understood that frontier survival required more than just courage or toughness. It required thinking carefully about how things worked and being willing to try different approaches when standard methods failed. The cold wind still cuts through the Wind River Valley in winter. Temperatures still drop to 20 below. Snow still piles deep. But the cabins that dot the landscape now use descendants of the stove modifications that Fletcher tested in 1835. The metal plate did its job. It kept the fire burning with half the wood. That was enough. The hearthstone marks the spot. The knowledge remains.